Imagine snow falling softly and without any real hurry against small, deep-set windows somewhere high in the mountains centuries ago. The building around you is stone, thick-walled, built to withstand weather that would flatten anything lighter, and it sits alone, or nearly alone, on a col or a shelf of rock high above the nearest valley, closer to the sky some nights than to any other living soul. Inside, a single lamp burns low in a small stone cell, and somewhere below, in the chapel, the last echo of a bell has only just finished settling into silence. This is an Alpine monastery, one of the small, hardy religious communities that took root, from the early medieval period onward, in some of the most remote and difficult high mountain passes of Europe. Places where ordinary travel was dangerous even in good weather and could be genuinely deadly once the snows came. These communities existed for reasons both spiritual and profoundly practical, offering prayer, yes, but also shelter, warmth, and rescue to travellers attempting to cross passes that claimed lives with grim regularity when the weather turned. Tonight, we're going to spend a night inside one of these mountain communities together. We'll listen to the bells that structured every single hour of the monks' day and night. We'll sit in the warm, smoky kitchen where a fire was never allowed to fully die, and we'll learn what it meant to live a life measured almost entirely by silence, by cold, and by a discipline of prayer so regular and so deeply worn into daily habit that it became, for the men who practiced it, as natural and unremarkable as breathing. So let your own breathing slow now, the way theirs did, and let's climb together up into the thin, quiet air of a snowbound mountain night. To understand why anyone would choose to build a religious community in one of the most difficult, weather-battered locations available to them, you first have to understand just how genuinely dangerous the high mountain passes of medieval and early modern Europe actually were, and how desperately travellers crossing them needed exactly the kind of help these communities were founded specifically to provide. The great Alpine passes connecting northern Europe to Italy carried an enormous volume of traffic across the medieval and early modern centuries. Pilgrims heading toward Rome, merchants moving goods between the great trading centres of the north and the wealthy Italian city-states, soldiers, diplomats, and ordinary travellers of every description, all of them facing the same basic, unforgiving reality once their route climbed high enough. Weather at these altitudes could turn with genuinely terrifying speed, a clear morning giving way, within hours, to a full blizzard capable of disorienting even an experienced local guide, and the cold itself, quite apart from any storm, was a real and constant killer. Travellers caught unprepared or simply unlucky, succumbing to exposure within a shockingly short span of time once true darkness and true cold set in around them. Avalanches posed their own particular sudden danger. Snow built up across a season's accumulated storms, releasing without warning down a slope, capable of burying a traveller, a whole party of travellers, or, in the worst recorded cases, threatening the monastery buildings themselves, positioned as they so often were on exactly the kind of high, exposed terrain where avalanche risk ran highest. And beyond weather and terrain, there was the simple, exhausting physical difficulty of the climb itself, thin air at high altitude making every step considerably harder work than the same distance covered at lower elevation. A genuine physiological burden that could leave even a fit, well-prepared traveller dangerously weakened by the time they reached the pass's highest and most exposed point. Into exactly this landscape of genuine, ever-present danger, religious communities established themselves, very often at the direct request or with the direct support of local rulers and church authorities who understood clearly how valuable and how genuinely life-saving a reliable shelter at the top of a dangerous pass could be. These foundations combined, from their very earliest years, a genuine spiritual mission, prayer, contemplation, the maintenance of a religious community's daily devotional life, with an equally genuine, equally serious practical mission, keeping the pass below them watched, keeping a fire burning and a bed available for anyone caught by the weather, and keeping trained men and dogs ready to search for travellers who had gone missing in a storm. Life inside the monastery, whatever the weather outside, was governed above nearly everything else by a strict, unbroken rhythm of prayer, structured around a series of fixed daily and nightly services known collectively as the Divine Office. And understanding this rhythm is essential to understanding what it actually felt like to live, sleep, and wake within these walls. The office divided the full 24-hour cycle into a series of distinct prayer times, beginning in the deepest hours of the night with the service known as matins, called sometimes vigils, typically observed somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, when monks rose from their beds in the cold dark, dressed quickly in whatever warm clothing the community's rule permitted, and made their way, often by the faint light of a single carried lamp, down cold stone corridors to the chapel for a lengthy period of psalms, readings and prayer. This was followed, considerably later, by lauds, observed around dawn, and then by a further series of shorter daytime offices spaced through the working hours before the day's prayer finally closed with vespers in the early evening and compline shortly before the community retired, for whatever sleep remained before the whole cycle began again with matins. This meant that a monk's sleep, much like the sleep of the sailors we visited on an earlier evening together, was never a single unbroken stretch through the night, but was instead deliberately, structurally fragmented, a period of rest before matins, the office itself in the deep cold hours of the night, and then a further shorter period of sleep afterward before the working day properly began. Modern sleep researchers have noted with real interest how closely this deliberately broken pattern resembles the same biphasic sleep pattern we discussed in an earlier story about prehistoric life, a period of sleep, a wakeful interval, and a further period of sleep, suggesting that this rhythm, imposed here quite deliberately through religious discipline, may sit closer to certain natural human sleep tendencies than the single unbroken night sleep most of us now consider the only normal pattern. The bell itself, rung from the monastery's own tower to call the community to each successive office, carried real, serious weight beyond its simple, practical function of marking time. We've discussed, in an earlier evening together, how medieval village bells were rung against approaching storms, believed to carry genuine spiritual authority through their consecrated bronze voice, and a monastery's own bell, rung with even greater regularity and even deeper devotional seriousness, carried this same weight amplified many times over, its sound understood as an active, ongoing act of prayer in itself, a voice calling not merely the monks within the walls, but in the understanding of the wider communities scattered through the valleys below, the whole surrounding landscape into a shared rhythm of devotion, audible for a considerable distance across still mountain air on a clear night, a small, steady, reassuring sound to any traveller still making their way toward the monastery's shelter through the gathering dark. Let's turn now to the practical, life-saving work that ran alongside this deep rhythm of prayer, because the hospitality offered to travellers by these mountain communities represents one of the most genuinely admirable and consistently documented aspects of their entire history. The rule of hospitality, followed by most religious communities of this period, held that any traveller arriving at the monastery's door, regardless of their wealth, status, or even their religious faith, was to be received, warmed, fed, and sheltered without payment or condition, a practice rooted in genuine theological conviction about the sacred obligation to care for strangers, but sustained in these particular high mountain communities by an equally genuine, hard-won practical understanding of just how quickly hospitality withheld could mean a traveller's death. Guest quarters, separate from the monks' own more austere sleeping cells, were maintained specifically for this purpose, kept warmed and provisioned even during the quietest stretches of the year when few travellers were expected, because the monastery's entire reputation and its entire practical usefulness to the surrounding region depended on this shelter being genuinely, reliably available whenever it was needed, at any hour, in any weather. Some of the most famous of these mountain communities developed, over the centuries, a genuinely remarkable additional practice, the breeding and training of large, powerful dogs specifically suited to search and rescue work in deep snow. Animals whose keen sense of smell and considerable physical strength made them extraordinarily effective at locating travellers buried or disoriented by an avalanche or a sudden blinding storm. These dogs, cared for and trained by the monks themselves across generations of careful breeding, would accompany search parties out into genuinely dangerous conditions, sniffing out a buried traveller's location often long before any human searcher could have found them unaided, and their reputation for exactly this kind of life-saving work would eventually spread far beyond the mountains themselves, becoming, in later centuries, one of the most recognized and most celebrated symbols of the entire Alpine monastic tradition. A monk assigned to watch duty on a night of genuinely dangerous weather carried real, serious responsibility, listening for any sound that might indicate a traveller struggling toward the monastery through the storm, a distant shout, the faint jingle of a mule's harness bells, and ready, at a moment's notice, to rouse the rest of the community and organise a search party if the weather and the hour allowed it. This watch was maintained with the same seriousness and the same disciplined rotation we discussed aboard a medieval ship's night watches, understanding that a single missed signal, a single traveller passed by unnoticed in the dark and the snow, could mean the difference between a rescued life and a lost one. Just as we visited an Italian scholar's library in an earlier story tonight, it's worth spending real time here on the monastery's own scriptorium, because these remote mountain communities, whatever their harsh physical circumstances, carried forward exactly the same patient tradition of copying, preserving and studying manuscripts that we discussed in connection with the great monastic libraries of the medieval and early Renaissance world. Working conditions in a mountain scriptorium presented their own particular, considerable challenges beyond the ordinary difficulties of careful manuscript copying we discussed in our library evening. Cold itself posed a genuine, constant threat to the work, ink prone to thickening or even freezing in truly severe weather, fingers growing numb and clumsy after even a modest stretch of time spent holding a pen still and steady in an unheated stone room, and monks copying manuscripts through the long winter months developed real, practiced strategies for managing this cold, working in shorter sessions with frequent breaks to warm hands near whatever brazier or fire the scriptorium was permitted, wearing fingerless gloves specifically designed to allow fine penwork while still offering some protection against the chill. And yet, despite these real difficulties, mountain monasteries produced and preserved genuinely significant manuscript collections across the medieval centuries, their relative isolation proving in certain respects a genuine advantage rather than a pure hardship, since these remote communities were considerably less exposed to the warfare, political upheaval, and urban fire that periodically devastated manuscript collections held in more accessible, more contested locations. A text copied carefully in a high mountain scriptorium, protected by distance and difficulty of access as much as by careful physical preservation, stood a genuinely better chance of surviving intact across the centuries than the same text might have in a more prominent, more vulnerable location closer to the centres of medieval political and military conflict. The particular quality of silence available in these mountain scriptoria deserves its own mention as well, because it was, in a very real sense, more complete than almost anywhere else a medieval scribe might have worked. No bustling town beyond the walls, no cart traffic, no marketplace noise drifting in through a window, only the deep, settled quiet of high mountain air, broken occasionally by wind against the stone walls outside, or on a clear winter night, by nothing at all beyond the soft, steady scratch of a pen and the monk's own quiet, careful breathing. Let's move now from the chapel and the scriptorium down to the monastery's kitchen, because keeping a mountain community fed and warm through a long, genuinely harsh alpine winter required careful, sustained planning and considerable practical skill, and the kitchen itself, with its constantly tended fire, offered one of the few genuinely warm gathering spaces available anywhere within the monastery's cold stone walls. Provisioning a high mountain community for winter meant thinking months in advance about exactly how a household would sustain itself through a stretch of the year when fresh supply from the valleys below might become genuinely impossible for weeks or even months at a stretch, roads and passes buried too deep in snow for any but the most desperate or best equipped traveller to attempt, grain, dried and salted meat, hard cheeses capable of surviving long storage without spoiling, dried fruits and vegetables, and, where the monastery's own land and livestock allowed it, a careful accumulation of milk, butter, and other dairy products preserved through salting or hardening into long-lasting forms, all had to be gathered, prepared, and carefully stored well before the first serious snows arrived and sealed the pass for the season. The monastery's own kitchen fire held a particular, genuinely central importance within this whole careful system of winter survival, tended continuously through the coldest months, in a discipline not so very different from the careful nightly fire tending we discussed in a medieval cottage in one of our earliest evenings together, though scaled up considerably to meet the needs of a whole community rather than a single family. This fire provided not only the heat needed for cooking the community's meals, but very often the only genuinely warm space available anywhere within the monastery's otherwise cold stone walls, and monks off duty from their various assigned tasks, prayer, study, watch duty, gravitated naturally toward the kitchen during whatever free hours the day's structured rhythm allowed, drawn by exactly the same simple, universal human pull toward warmth and light, that has drawn people toward a good fire in every single culture and every single century we've explored together on this show. Meals themselves, eaten together in the community's refectory, followed their own careful, disciplined structure, very often taken in silence or accompanied only by a single monk, reading aloud from scripture or another approved devotional text while the rest of the community ate quietly, a practice that transformed even the simple, practical necessity of eating into another small, structured act of shared communal discipline, one more thread woven into the same overall rhythm of prayer, work, and careful, deliberate silence that governed nearly every hour of monastic life. We've mentioned silence several times already this evening, but it deserves its own careful, unhurried attention because the particular Alpine monastic tradition of maintained silence represents one of the most distinctive and, to modern ears, genuinely striking features of this whole way of life. Many monastic rules of this period prescribed extended periods of silence throughout the day, sometimes near total silence outside the specific hours set aside for necessary conversation, communal prayer, or instruction, a discipline understood not as simple deprivation, but as an active, positive, spiritual practice, clearing away the ordinary noise and distraction of daily speech to make room for deeper, more sustained contemplation and prayer. Monks who needed to communicate necessary practical information during these silent hours very often developed simple systems of hand signs, gestures indicating common needs or requests, allowing essential daily coordination to continue without breaking the maintained discipline of vocal silence. For a newcomer to this way of life, the adjustment to sustained silence could be genuinely difficult. Surviving accounts from various monastic traditions describing real struggle among new arrivals, accustomed to the ordinary chatter and noise of secular life outside the walls. But for monks who had lived within this discipline for years, silence very often came to be described not as hardship at all, but as a genuine, deeply valued comfort, a settled, spacious quiet within which the mind, freed from the constant small distractions of ordinary conversation, could settle into a far deeper and more sustained state of calm than most people outside the walls ever had the chance to experience. This cultivated silence took on a particular additional quality within the specific setting of a high mountain monastery, layered over and blended with the genuine natural silence of the surrounding landscape itself, deep snow muffling sound in the way it always does, thin mountain air carrying what sound there was for genuinely long distances across otherwise still, undisturbed space. A monk stepping outside the walls on a clear winter night between the offices of Compline and Matins might find himself standing in a silence so complete, so total, that his own breathing and heartbeat became genuinely, distinctly audible to him. The whole vast, dark, snow-covered landscape around him, holding itself in exactly the same deep, patient stillness that governed his own disciplined daily life within the walls. No community facing the genuine physical hardship of Alpine winter life could avoid, entirely, the reality of illness and injury among both its own members and the travellers it sheltered, and the monastery's infirmary, staffed by monks with real, accumulated practical medical knowledge, formed an essential part of the community's overall function, both for its own members and for the wider region it served. Medical knowledge within these communities drew on the same broader medieval and early modern medical tradition available elsewhere in Europe: herbal remedies, careful attention to diet and rest, and the accumulated practical wisdom passed down through successive generations of monks who had themselves cared for the sick and injured before them, but it was shaped in these particular mountain communities by genuinely specific, recurring local dangers. Frostbite and hypothermia, from travellers caught unprepared by sudden weather, required real, practiced skill to treat correctly, since improper rewarming of severely frozen tissue could cause genuine additional harm, and monks with experience in exactly this kind of care developed real, hard-won expertise in managing it safely, gradual warming, careful attention to affected extremities, and close monitoring through the following hours and days for signs of lasting damage. Snow blindness, a genuinely common and painful affliction among travellers who had spent extended time exposed to bright sunlight reflecting off snow without adequate eye protection, was another recurring complaint the infirmary regularly treated. Cool compresses and rest in a darkened room offering the primary available relief until the affected traveller's vision gradually recovered on its own. And altitude itself produced its own recognized, if not fully medically understood, set of symptoms among travellers unaccustomed to the thin air of the highest passes: headache, breathlessness, and general weakness that monks accustomed to the altitude themselves had learned, through long practical experience, to recognize and to treat with rest, warmth, and, where the traveller's condition allowed it, a controlled, gradual descent toward lower and more breathable air as soon as weather safely permitted it. This accumulated practical medical wisdom, built up across generations of a single community's continuous residence in one of Europe's most physically demanding environments, represented its own genuine, if often under-recognized, contribution to the wider medieval and early modern medical tradition, knowledge passed down carefully from one generation of monks to the next, in exactly the same patient. Oral tradition we've seen govern the transmission of practical knowledge in every single culture this show has visited, from a prehistoric mother teaching her daughter which roots were safe to eat, to a Renaissance scholar's careful notes in the margin of a borrowed manuscript. Let's spend a little time, gently, with the genuine fear a truly severe mountain storm could bring, because it would be dishonest in this evening's story, just as it was in our earlier evening aboard a medieval ship, to leave out the sharper, more immediate danger that could interrupt even the most carefully maintained rhythm of prayer and daily routine we've spent this whole evening exploring. A storm of real severity, arriving without sufficient warning, or a traveller known to be somewhere on the pass when the weather turned violent, produced a genuine, focused urgency within the monastery that overrode, for as long as the emergency lasted, even the community's normally strict adherence to its regular prayer schedule. Monks would gather quickly, dogs roused and redded, lanterns lit and carefully shielded against the wind, warm clothing and emergency supplies, blankets, a flask of warmed wine or spirits, gathered swiftly before the search party set out into conditions that genuinely threatened the searcher's own safety as much as the missing travellers. Surviving accounts and later records from these communities describe searches conducted in genuinely harrowing conditions. Visibility reduced to almost nothing, wind strong enough to make simply remaining upright a real physical struggle, and monks pressing forward regardless, guided by the dog's keener senses and by their own long, hard-won familiarity with the terrain. Familiarity built across years of exactly this kind of dangerous, necessary work. Not every search ended successfully, and the monastery's own records and traditions carried, alongside their many stories of successful rescue, real memory of the travellers who had not been found in time, or who had been found, tragically, too late for anything but a proper Christian burial and a place, thereafter, in the community's ongoing prayers. When a search did succeed, when a half-frozen, exhausted traveller was brought back through the monastery's own doors and into the warmth of the kitchen fire, wrapped in blankets and given warmed drink and careful, attentive care through the following hours, the relief within the community was genuine and profound. One more life added to the long accumulated record of exactly the work these mountain communities had been founded centuries before specifically to perform. And when the storm itself finally passed, the monastery's normal rhythm resumed, bells ringing once again for whichever office had been interrupted by the emergency, the whole community settling back into its familiar, disciplined pattern of prayer and work and careful, sustained silence. The crisis folded, like every crisis before it, into the community's own long, ongoing collective memory. Let's bring ourselves back now, gently, from the sharper edge of storm and danger to the more ordinary, more peaceful rhythm of a calmer winter night, because most nights, thankfully, held no such crisis at all, simply the same patient, steady cycle of prayer, work, and rest that had governed this community's life for generation after generation. Picture it now, this calmer, more ordinary version of the evening. Compline has been sung, the day's final office, and the community has retired to their individual cells for whatever sleep remains before Matins calls them back to the chapel in the deep, cold hours ahead. Snow continues to fall outside softly, steadily, without any particular urgency, settling deeper across the already snow-covered roof and courtyard. The kitchen fire has been banked for the night, much as we discussed in an earlier evening's medieval cottage, kept alive but low, ready to be built back up quickly should tomorrow's cold demand it. Somewhere, a dog trained for exactly this kind of mountain rescue work shifts and settles near whatever warm corner it's been permitted, its own rest, like the monk's own, structured around the same underlying readiness to be roused at a moment's notice should the need arise. And high above the monastery's own stone walls, the same vast, star-filled sky we've admired from a medieval cottage doorway, and from the deck of a ship, and from the window of a Renaissance scholar's study stretches out over the mountains, clearer and closer here, at this altitude, than almost anywhere else these stories have taken us. The thin air offering a view of the stars unobstructed by almost anything at all, beyond the mountain's own dark, snow-covered silhouette. There is something worth carrying with you, as your own eyes grow heavy tonight, about how completely this community trusted its own disciplined rhythm, night after night, generation after generation, to carry them safely through even the harshest winter this remote, difficult, beautiful landscape could offer. They did not fight the cold and the isolation with force alone. They met it with patience, with careful preparation, with the discipline of prayer and rest and readiness so deeply practiced it had become, for the men who lived it, as natural and unremarkable as the falling snow itself. Just as we've explored in earlier evenings together the rich body of protective belief that surrounded a medieval cottage, a haunted castle, and a wooden ship crossing dangerous water, the high mountain passes surrounding these monasteries carried their own dense layer of folklore, much of it held not by the monks themselves, whose faith gave them their own distinct framework for understanding the dangers around them, but by the travellers, guides, and local mountain communities who lived and worked in these same difficult landscapes across the surrounding centuries. Certain peaks and certain stretches of particularly treacherous terrain acquired their own local reputations, passed down through generations of guides and travellers, the same way a stretch of forest road once carried its own cautionary reputation among medieval travellers we discussed in an earlier story. Sudden, violent local weather, an avalanche striking without apparent cause, a traveller lost on a stretch of path that seemed, by every ordinary account, perfectly safe, were sometimes attributed in local tradition to spirits or forces believed to inhabit the mountain itself, requiring their own kind of careful, respectful caution from anyone passing through their territory. Not entirely unlike the wary courtesy we discussed medieval villagers extending to the fairy folk believed to dwell along certain hedgerows and groves. Local guides, whose accumulated practical knowledge of a particular pass's dangers made them genuinely indispensable to any traveller attempting the crossing, very often carried forward this same blended tradition we've seen again and again across every culture this show has visited. Practical, hard-won expertise about weather patterns, snow conditions, and the safest available route, folded together seamlessly with careful, customary gestures of respect toward the mountain itself, a quiet word spoken before setting out, a small offering or token left at a particular difficult point along the path, a specific saint's protection invoked before attempting a stretch of trail known for its danger. The monks themselves, whatever their own official theological framework for understanding the mountain's dangers, lived close enough to these local traditions, and close enough to local guides and travellers who held them, that a genuine practical blending of belief very often occurred here too, much as we saw blend so thoroughly in an ordinary medieval household's daily protective practice. Certain natural phenomena specific to high mountain environments contributed their own genuine strangeness to this body of folklore. Phenomena we now understand through straightforward atmospheric science, but which, to travellers and monks alike experiencing them directly, without that modern explanatory framework, carried a genuinely uncanny, otherworldly quality. A phenomenon sometimes called the Brocken spectre, in which a traveller's own shadow cast by low sun onto mist or cloud below them appears dramatically enlarged and sometimes surrounded by a faint halo of coloured light, startled and unsettled travellers across many centuries of Alpine crossing, some genuinely convinced in the moment of encountering it that they had glimpsed something supernatural rather than simply their own shadow interacting with fog and light in an unfamiliar dramatic way. Strange sounds too, the wind moving through narrow rock formations in ways that could produce genuinely eerie, almost voice-like tones, or the distant deep groaning of shifting ice and snow added their own layer to travellers' accumulated stories of the pass's stranger, less easily explained qualities. The monastery itself, standing as it did at exactly the point where this whole body of local folklore and danger met the more formal, structured protection of Christian prayer and ritual, occupied a particular interesting position within this landscape of belief. A traveller arriving at its doors, having survived a crossing shaped by exactly this blend of practical skill, folk caution, and genuine danger, found there a further, final layer of protection, the monastery's own blessing, its own consecrated chapel, its own community of monks whose entire daily life was organised around exactly the kind of sustained, disciplined prayer believed capable of holding back whatever danger, natural or otherwise, the mountain might still pose. For many travellers, reaching the monastery's threshold represented not merely physical safety after a genuinely dangerous crossing, but a kind of spiritual arrival as well, passing from a landscape governed by uncertain, half-understood danger into one governed, at least for the length of their stay, by careful, ordered, deeply reassuring ritual. So let the snow outside that mountain monastery continue falling now, softly, steadily, settling deeper across the sleeping rooftops and the quiet courtyard below. Let the last kitchen fire ease down into its own banked, patient rest, the same slow, careful settling we've watched a fire make in every single evening we've spent together on this show. Let the great bell in the tower above hang still and silent for now, its next call to prayer still some hours away, waiting, the way it always waits, patient and unhurried for exactly the right moment to sound again. You don't need to rise for matins tonight. That deep, disciplined watch is already being kept, the way it has been kept for centuries by men whose whole lives were built around exactly this kind of patient, careful readiness. Whatever storm might gather beyond these walls tonight, real or imagined, has no claim on you here, wrapped warm in your own quiet corner of this vast snow-covered mountain silence. If this quiet night in an Alpine monastery helped carry you towards sleep, you're welcome to leave a gentle tap of a thumb before your own eyes close the rest of the way, and let us know in the comments which quiet, remote corner of history you'd like us to visit next. And if you'd like to keep returning to nights like this one, consider following the show, so the next bell is already resting quietly in its tower, waiting for you, whenever you're ready to climb back up into these mountains with us again. For now, though, none of that needs to happen yet. There is only the soft, steady fall of snow against old stone, and the deep, patient hush of a mountain night, and the old, old feeling, carried down through centuries of exactly this same careful watchfulness, that you are sheltered and warmed and safe, until the bell finally calls the world to rise again. Rest now. The watch is kept, the fire is banked, and the mountain holds its silence around you. Morning will come in its own good time, the way it always has.